Hello, welcome to the second component of the punishment video lecture. So we were in the middle of discussing the Thompson et al. Article 1999, and we had just finished talking about the different types of target behaviors that they were targeting during the specific study. So sessions were conducted 2 to 6 times per day in various rooms at the day treatment center, and each session did last for 10 minutes. Researchers first conducted a functional analysis to determine the function of the self-injurious behavior and found that all of the participants' SIB was not maintained by social mediation. This does suggest that their self-injurious behavior was most likely maintained by automatic reinforcement. The researchers also conducted an assessment to identify preferred items, so they did a preference assessment to identify items that could possibly serve or function as reinforcers during the study. And they also conducted a punisher assessment to identify different punishment procedures that may be effective in suppressing the SIB. And then the effects of punishment were evaluated in a reversal design for Shelley and in a multiple baseline design for the other 3 participants. They embedded in the design a multi-element design that alternated between reinforcement and no reinforcement procedures. And if you go ahead and pull up your Thompson article, we'll look at the first figure. And so you can see on the x-axis we have number of sessions, and on the y-axis we have responses of SIB per minute or the total percentages of intervals that SIB was present. And so if we go up and we look at Shelley, we can see the open circles are no reinforcement and the closed circles are reinforcement. And they alternate between no punish and punishment conditions. And you can see during the first no punishment condition that Shelley was more likely going to engage in self-injurious behaviors when she was receiving punishment but no reinforcement, receiving no punishment and no reinforcement. But then if you see that when she received reinforcement, her levels of self-injurious behaviors did decrease. So then they implemented the punishment procedure, and you can see punishment combined with no reinforcement is more effective at decreasing problem behaviors. But then when you combine the punishment with the reinforcement, in this phase it is the most effective at decreasing the problem behavior. So they reverse back to the no punishment session. You can see there's a slight carryover effect, but then her data does start to level out, and you can see there's still a differentiation between the no reinforcement and reinforcement, but the behavior does increase in rate, and she does have more responses per minute during the no punishment session. So they go back and they implement the punishment session, and we see an immediate decrease in problem behavior. And if you look at the reinforcement plus punishment is the lowest level across 2 conditions, pretty strong control, experimental control, suggesting that it is necessary to have the combination of reinforcement and punishment if you want to have the best treatment or to produce the lowest level of problem behavior. And you can see across Ricky, Donna, and Lynn that the same thing kind of happens in baseline, in the no punishment condition. There's higher levels of problem behavior. The data is a little more variable. But then when you go into the punishment condition, you can see that reinforcement plus punishment for all 3 participants does produce the lowest level of problem behaviors. We're going to move on to our last study, which is the Pratt et al. 2011. And so with this study, we'll do a little bit of background first. Children with behavioral difficulties often pose requests that cannot be honored. And some reasons may be that the item is not available or that it can't be delivered immediately. When a child is denied the requested item, they may often engage in problem behaviors. So, for example, I had a child who I worked with, a client. She was 5 years old, diagnosed with autism and cerebral palsy, and she would often ask her mother either for Tootsie Rolls, a drink, Elmo. She had a whole list, and if her mother didn't provide those items within 5 to 10 seconds, she would immediately start hitting her head on any hard surface that was around. And she did hit her head hard enough to cause like goose eggs and bruising. So it was something that was not safe for her to engage in. So as a result, her parents, being very concerned, immediately gave her everything that she wanted because it provided that brief pause in headbanging, and they were keeping her safe. So what happened is the parents weren't able to do anything. They couldn't take a shower. They couldn't cook in a different room. They couldn't clean in a different room. They couldn't go out in the community without packing loads of stuff, because if they didn't have the one item that they forgot to bring, even though they had everything else, she would engage in that headbanging. So it ended up shaping up their parents' behavior to be, pretty erratic, and she basically got everything she wanted. So you can see that that was a problem. So one thing that you can do when something like this arises is teach the individual either how to accept the word no, or how to wait an appropriate amount of time before they can receive access to that item. So you can either tell them no with an explanation, or you can just tell them no with no explanation, and they, have to learn to accept it. Functional communication training was also brought up as a protocol that is used to teach children how to request words. We've talked about that earlier. Sorry, not request words, request preferred items. And typically when you're first teaching functional communication training, you're going to teach it using a continuous schedule of reinforcement. So every single time the individual asks for that item, you're going to provide access to that preferred item. And this is really great when teaching a new skill, but once they've mastered that skill and they start asking for that item several times in a row, you can't always provide it. And you want to make sure that you fade that level of reinforcement appropriately so that you don't have somebody who's over requesting or expects to receive that reinforcement every time. And even if you don't fade at all, that's when it does become pretty significantly problematic. Another way to evoke compliance that the authors did mention in the intro is to use do statements instead of using don't statements. So the idea is that if you tell somebody what to do, you are providing a replacement behavior, and you're providing that opportunity for them to gain access to reinforcement. Versus if I tell you what not to do, I'm simply just punishing that behavior. You're not gaining any reinforcement out of it. And there are some complications to that. If I say don't hit me, you may have not been planning on hitting me, but now I put the idea in your head. So now chances are you might hit me. So you always want to try and make sure that you use do statements because it provides the opportunity for reinforcement, and you're teaching a new behavior that meets the same function. If you tell them what not to do, you're not meeting that function. And another problem associated with that is so let's say we've punished hitting by saying don't hit, and it's effective, but they still need the function met for that need. So what are they going to do? They're going to come up with their own other problem behavior to get that need met. So now they're not hitting. That's great, but they might start biting you. So you want to make sure that you're the one choosing the new behavior, not just decreasing one and letting them choose the new one. So in the Pratt et al. Study, the participant, who was Philip, was a 13-year-old boy diagnosed with Waardenburg syndrome, which is a genetic condition that causes physical abnormalities and changes in the color of eyes and skin, and sometimes skin impairments. There are two different types of the Waardenburg syndrome. There's type 1 and type 2, and depending on which type you have, you may or may not have hearing impairment, and you may or may not have specific genetic abnormalities. In addition to the syndrome, he was diagnosed with autism. He did live in a residential school for individuals with behavior disorders, and sessions were conducted in his classroom. Philip's target behaviors were oppositional vocalizations, which were things such as saying no, Loud vocalizations such as yelling or screaming, disruption, so throwing chairs, tipping over tables, and aggression. Target behaviors were measured two ways in the study. They measured the latency from the trainer response to the response of Philip. So if the trainer said no and then gave him an explanation, then they measured the amount of time from the no and the explanation to when Philip engaged in any problem behaviors. They did collect IOA. The second form of recording that they used was a 10-second partial interval recording, which basically means that if he engaged in the problem behavior any time during that 10 seconds, it was recorded. IOA was collected during the functional analysis and during all sessions, and IOA for the FA was 100%, and IOA for all of the sessions was 96%. I'm sorry, I said that incorrectly. IOA for the FA was 100%, and IOA during sessions for latency was 96%, and IOA for partial interval data was 97%. So the results of the FA indicated that the target behaviors were maintained by access to tangibles. So the researchers compared Philip's responses to the different responses from the researchers. The 4 responses were no with an explanation, no with no explanation, no with an explanation and an alternative choice, and yes with a contingency. So let's go ahead and take a look at the results in the graphs. So I'm pulling up figure 1. Another thing that they looked at in the study is they wanted to look at would reinforcing different levels of a response class hierarchy affect the different types of problem behavior. So they took his problem behavior and they put it in this hierarchy where it usually started with oppositional vocalizations and then would lead to loud vocalizations and then go to disruption and then to aggression or threat of aggression. And it typically happened in this order every time. So what they did is they looked at what happens when we provide the reinforcement with the oppositional vocalizations, and then what happens when we reinforce disruption, and what happens when we reinforce the aggression. So what if we just wait a little longer before we provide that reinforcement? And then what happens when we use extinction altogether? And as you can see, that if the earlier on in the response class hierarchy that they provided the reinforcement, the less likely they were to see disruption or aggression, suggesting that when working with individuals who you can clearly see some type of response class hierarchy, you may want to intervene sooner in the hierarchy and provide reinforcement more sooner for the less intense or the less severe problem behaviors in order to prevent the more intense and more severe problem behaviors from occurring. So this concludes, I apologize. So the study does have a couple limitations that we should note before ending our lecture today. The first one is they did only use one participant, so they weren't able to demonstrate high levels of external validity, and we're not really able to say whether or not this type of procedure will be effective for all individuals who engage in problem behaviors that are maintained by access to tangibles. So future research should probably look at the different types, looking at including more participants in their studies to see if it's going to generalize to different participants. So this concludes our lecture on punishment. Have a great day.